Well, here she is, a beautiful, natural Gibson ES 335. Dun dun dun. Trademark, familiar headstock, logo we all know and love. String Butler we all know and hate as an attempt to make the damn thing stay in tune. A nut of some kind, I'm not sure what the material is. It sort of looks like a bit tusky, maybe a bit new bony, but we're going to replace it with an adjustable one, which in my experience, along with stretching the strings out properly, negates the need for the butler, so we shall take care of that shortly. Now, as we come down this thing with its lovely dot markers and its nibs, we have here a very standard, in the nicest possible way, ES335 by the looks of it, with its certificate of genuineness in there. And we've got nylon looking saddles here, and there's a bit of a slight string spacing issue on these. I don't know if you can see, but I think the high E is a bit off to one side, so I don't know if we can fix that without taking all of the saddles down a little bit. So I shall look at that closely towards the end. So this guitar is Chris's, and it's down for just that, a setup and with a adjustable Tusq nut and precision fret leveling. And we've got an ancient repair, or a couple of repairs here actually, but we have a very nice one with splines, nicely done, and overall it feels great. You can see the workings, of course, but who cares? It's it's beautifully done, and it's strengthened the neck, so it should stay nice and solid from then onwards. Got a nice finish on the back. Look at that lovely grain. Well, you can see that. There you go, a bit better flame and grain. So it's a beaut. Lovely looking thing. Big. The only flaw on it at all is the slight shrinkage of the binding. Well, you can see that in there. The binding, well, sorry, I don't know whether it's the binding dries or I think it's the binding shrinking and drying, and it's creating a little lip. Can you see there? And that's on both sides. That's the only place on the whole guitar where it's showing its age or wear or drying out, and not really much you can do. There's a little bit of good old-fashioned play wear there and all around this F-hole actually, but lovely dark, kind of slightly purpley rosewood neck. It's probably not rosewood, it's probably something else. I'm just saying rosewood because I'm ignorant. So what we're going to do, well, we're going to do a setup. In some ways it's a straightforward one. It's going to get the same loving treatment as any guitar, even though it's a Gibson ES335. It doesn't get more or less loving treatment than a Rally Neo Sound 335 or a Epiphone 339 or something like that. Same love and attention. It's currently set very low, but it does have some fret slap attached to it, but it is low, and so we're going to do whatever I can to make it stay in tune without the butler, and to just very gently level it and make sure everything's in good nick, as low an action as possible, and then take care of or look at the saddles as well. Now, alongside of this, Chris, this is a note to you. I've got a number of little video modules that I've got to create for my upcoming ebook, and the way I tend to do it is to do it within the work I'm doing on a variety of guitars at the time, so I've got a kind of diary of that. Oh, by the way, sorry if you get to look at the view out through there. I'm attempting to keep this room relatively cool. It's 23.8 degrees, which normally, if I didn't have that door open, I would be dripping in sweat. I probably will be anyway, but it's kind of, it gets warm in here with body temperature. So yeah, because of these little segments I'm going to make for the videos, I'm going to have to do a few stop and starts, and within that stop and start we will feature the clapper board. if I remember, which I will remember to do it. So each time, throughout these videos over the next few days, you'll see me writing up some things. So for example, the next one come out will be A03, and it's called Trust the Pattern. I probably end up making the same point several times, but I kind of know what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do is stop and restart and clap aboard in this new segment. Hey, look, the new segment. Well, you hear it on one and see it on the other. Okay. So welcome to segment A03. And this is covering what I've learned in the years I've been doing this setup work. And one of the ones I've noticed, or that I've come to see as dependable, and actually a lot of people don't trust it, is the expected sequence of intonation spacing of the saddles. And so I have a phrase in my head that says trust the pattern. And the pattern on any standard guitar with 3 wound and 3 plain, if I'm drawing the bridge, looks like this. The high E is the shortest string length, the B steps back, the G steps back again, the D steps forward of the G, the A steps back of the D, and the E steps back of the A. And so what you can see in the other camera, this camera here, is on a 3 plain and 3 wound, you have 2 groups of 3. And that's the expected pattern. And it's so dependable that if you intonate and get this one first, you can stagger all the other ones on the saddle and they'll be correct. And what you'll find is there is about 1 millimeter between each of these, and about half, 0.5 to 0.75 forward on the D, and then 1 back and 1 back again. So that's what you can do, and so providing you get the high E correct, you can set all the other ones off that and they'll be almost bang smack on. Now, why do I say it's important to trust that pattern? Well, you'll see loads of people with guitars for sale or guitars they bring to you. They'll have them set in all manner of different places, and sometimes you look at it and you go, something's not right there. And some people will say, no, that's absolutely correct. And it's true, they may have had to have set the saddles there. But if you see the saddles out of position, so we see one here, for example, we look close up at this, and straight away I can tell there's a problem there. First of all, there's a problem because the low E is not staggered back a good millimeter from the A. Now, it could be that the A has pulled back too far and the E is in the right place and the A could go forward. Let's hope for that. But there's something not set right here. Okay, and so straight away the trust the pattern axiom says something isn't going quite right with this. Now, I've actually, before we started, I just pinged and checked with my tuner over there, pinged and checked all the notes, and actually all of these were sharp and they all needed to come back, which doesn't give me a good feeling about this one. I got a feeling this one may be slammed far back as it will go when we get to doing it. Now, this isn't normally the sequence I would deal with the intonation. I'm doing it as this video unit, but it might as well do it at this point in the guitar. But without doing anything about it right now, because it's not essential that we do, I'm just sort of alerted to the fact that some of this is wrong. But interestingly, somebody would say to me, well, I actually did this intonation and that's how it came out. And if that's the case, then I will tell you that it's probably quite likely that one of these strings is dud. Now, in a standard set of strings from a decent manufacturer like D'Addario, once in a while you'll get a dud string. By the way, they're not 6s, they're 9s. Once in a while you'll get a dud string. And what will happen is you'll know you've got a dud string because one of these is way out of the sequence. So if you trust the normal 3 and 3, by the way, if you have 4 wound and 2 plain, you have a 2 and a 4 pattern, but you trust that the same. It's just slightly different. If you often will find, you'll know you've got a dud string because one of the saddles will be noticeably out of whack. Now, if you don't trust the pattern, you won't really notice that. You'll just go, okay, that's how it is. And a lot of people think it's not, surely it's very complicated. It takes loads of variables into account. Well, it has some variables, the equation of intonation, but all things being equal, with a standard guitar, a 6-string guitar with 3 plain and 3 wound, and assuming those strings are from a reasonably well-known manufacturer that has standardized quality control, you expect a 3 and 3 setting. And that's why we can say quite confidently that if one of them is out of kilter, then it's something wrong with the string. And the good thing about that is, if I don't know what I did with them now, somewhere over here, sometimes you might find yourself, actually it's not so much, these are cheap strings, they're Chinese manufactured, and actually these, in my experience, these tend to intonate pretty well. But the ones that really are a problem, and I don't unfortunately have any here to demonstrate with, but you could demonstrate for yourself at a later date, are the fake ones. So I recently bought a set of 3 Ernie Ball strings in a pack, and I knew they were going to be fake, but I wanted to test them and see how bad they were for fakes. And what I found was that the tolerances, or the thicknesses of each of the strings in the set, were so way off what they should have been that they all intonated in different places. Because where these things intonate, it's so predictable because the quality control of the strings is so predictable. And so, providing you've got a decent quality set, you expect the 2 groups of 3, as I've mentioned. If you've bought some strings and you just can't seem to get them to intonate properly, or they won't seem to play in tune, then it may well be that this is your way of testing them. If the intonation is looking way out for that new set of strings that you bought, they may well be duds. And for example, if you pay 15, 16, 20 quid or whatever for a set of elixirs, which are definitely worth faking by Chinese manufacturers, and you put them on your guitar and they just, if they're even off that 3 and 3 pattern, I would suspect them straight away, because quality strings from good quality control factories are dependable in this 3 and 3 pattern. Okay, so there we go. That's one of the things I've learned since starting doing this setup work. It's not strictly about fret leveling or anything using the banana tool, but we'll see some more techniques of that later on in this setup. Okay, so I'm going to stop this again and restart. I think this makes sense doing it that way. I hope you don't mind, Chris, the stopping and starting, but I get extra value out of doing your setup, so I can reuse the material. Okay, so as discussed, we're going to leave the saddle till later on. We're going to figure out which is wrong. Like I said, my initial test tells me that these here need to go back some, which worries me about whether we're going to run out of space for this one. And it's even already turned round in its sort of reverse pattern, so there's no extra space we can regain from it. But now, if you're ever in doubt and you start to look at your guitar and you think, well, am I imagining it? It doesn't seem to intonate. You can always get your extra long ruler and run it over the neck. So start with the ruler touching the, let's move the guitar a little bit, touching the face of the nut, and let's look at the high E. And then we go up to here and we have the apex sitting on, I'm going to tell you right now, is 624. Okay, now anyone starting to think something right now? How about that? 624. That's where the E string is currently sitting. How many people know what the supposed scale length of the Gibson scale is? 628. That's why that appears to be sharp. It's too short. Is that, no, this is where you have to check your sense. 628. Well, let's just make sense. Is it really 628? It should be 2 times 514. Let's look at what the 12th fret says. Sorry, not 514, 614. Now here, in truth, this measures from the face of the nut to the 12th fret, it measures 312 and a half. 312 and a half, let's write this down. 312, it's actually 312, call it 312 and a half, but, and actually what you'd, 312. What is my brain? My brain. Okay, 312. That's not so bad then, because 312 and a half tells us, we said it came at 624, didn't we? 624. 312 makes it 625, so we're only a centimetre short. That's not so bad. But 625 mils, is that what your thing tells you? It doesn't tell me that normally. I can't, I've turned my phone off to stop any of this this disruption. I would have expected it to be closer to 628 as a scale length, but it's actually 625. And the one thing you can be sure of is that the scale length is in fact twice whatever the measurement from the nut to the 12th fret is, although it's nominally 628. That's what we often use as we always normally use as a start point. So interestingly, straight away, this guitar isn't 628, it's 625, but we know that our E is currently set at 624, so we need to go back a millimetre. That's why it's playing the harmonic, or the fretted note is playing sharp at the moment. We know we have to go a centimetre, not quite a centimetre, we have to go a millimetre in that direction. So let's just do that for the fun of doing it. Just out of interest, because we're out of sequence here, but I just want to see what sort of chance we stand at the moment of get in there, of taking this back all the way across all the strings. So we're going to do this. Thank you. There we go. And that was a tiny bit of tightening up, and that's gone ping. So I'll get a spare string to do this thing. Doesn't really matter the size of it. It's a 9 or a 10, but we'll just get high E spare. That's not high E spare. Have I used up my high? Oh, I don't believe it. Right, I'm going to get one from a cheap cheap set. This is just, these are going to be used as sacrificial strings anyway, but that's an annoying propensity for a string to break. I don't know if it's the fact that it's been wrapped round on itself, which is not a good thing to do. I think it sometimes puts an extra kink in the strings, which causes them to break if you try and slack them off or tighten them up like that. Okay, so we will raid a packet of strings, cheap strings, for a high E, just for the sake of doing the whatever it's called. What did I call it a minute ago? Sacrificial strings, and do all the fret leveling. So which is it? It's this one. Put these out of the way for other scrap purposes. So having moved the thing back, let's just check with the ruler again. I can see the apex of the saddle along the E track, and I'm going to place it at, what do we say, 625. There it is, dead on 625, where the string launches off. Okay, so that means the E should be intonated when I put this string, or it's closer to being intonated. And from that point, because I trust the pattern, I could give myself a head start. I don't like this thing, get through there. I could give myself something of a head start on the problems. This is kind of not necessarily the normal sequence I would go through, but because we're looking at this the business of the intonation early, often if there's an issue that needs kind of taking care of, I will look at it and make a decision. So doing this way round allows me to know in advance whether we've got a problem and whether it's one that actually is solvable or not on this guitar. Now the thing is, to me it seems, I have to go and check again because I've been working to 628 millimeters. Now maybe there's a millimeter or two's difference in the conversion from inches, but 2 millimeters or more, or 3 millimeters seems a lot. So either which way, somebody's made this guitar to 625. Okay, so now if I trust my system, I now am going to intonate this one in line with the E, which means pushing this one back a bit. Now because the whole of the thing is staggered backwards, the funny part is we don't need to probably go as far as the millimeter back. because you tend to find that you only have to do that when the saddle is in a straight line. So this is already staggered back a little bit, so we hopefully might get away with not so much of a stagger. That's the idea, because this is a bit further back by virtue of it being on a slant anyway. Now we've got the this one is a bit tricky. We've got this one that should be ahead of the should launch ahead of that one, and this one should come forward to here. So we may, judging by all that's going on here, we may just about be okay. But still, it's quite interesting to know that the this scale length is 625. So, to get on with things, I'm such a fool, I should have done another clapperboard. I'll do it in a sec. Okay, we're in tune. Now, just to see whether we got anywhere better with our intonation while we're at it, before I go into my next clapperboard section. That's on. That's on. So my guesstimate of 1mm, which is made up of a combination of stagger and physical turn of the bridge, it's worked so far. That one's looking sharp. That's sounding good. Those last two are playing off, but I have a feeling that they won't feel off at all when I put new strings on. So I'm going to assume that the difference is the fact that strings are worn out. Everything else in the sequence now is correct. So that's a good check. So I can breathe a bit easier, because if you actually do find at this stage that the actual playing length is wrong because the bridge is not in the right place and it should have been 628, and we're trying to make up for it by pushing the saddles further away than they need to go, or they can go, then we're in trouble. We'll never get it intonated. But as it happens, this has been made for 625, not 628, and as long as these frets here are a mathematical subdivision of that 625, or function of an equation that has that 625 put into it, or sorry, 312 and a half here and 625 in total, then the neck should play fine. It's problem when if this neck was made to 628 and this was placed as if it was 625, and that could have resulted in why, or could have explained why, the saddles were shoved up against the end with nowhere to go. Anyway, thankfully that's not the problem. Now I'm going to do another section here for which I will need my clapperboard, and then we'll move on. I'll try and keep these as short as sweet as possible, but it's just the only way I can do it. So this next one is A01 12-inch, and it's high E bend chokes, right? And if you ever see the next ebook, you'll kind of you look back and you go, oh, that's right, he was doing that while he was doing my Gibson. Section A01, high E bend chokes. That's the sound that I can use to align the audio, which is great when you're using a 2-camera shoot, baby. Right, so the only point about this, right, what are we doing here? Oh yes, this is section A01 for a 12-inch radius neck, and what I'm just looking to demonstrate is whether we've got any high E bends. So what you often find, what I look for on guitars when I'm leveling, are 3 types of things. There is, first of all, straightforward high or low frets in a single spot where you play it all the way up, and maybe you find a dead note, or don't mind the bridges rattling, or you find a sort of semi-choked note, or in worst cases you find 2 notes that play the same. That's the first thing I look for, and those would be the result of what I call high or low frets. And the kind of fret buzz we get from those is that familiar choking or buzzing when we know it's happening in one place only on the neck on that particular string. And we can identify it down to either being a single high fret following the note I was fretting, or a low one where I was fretting, which makes the next one apparently high. That's the first thing I look for, what is familiar fret, high or low frets, which by and large do typically restrict the lowness that we can choose for our action. And so it's those frets to begin with that we have to level out if we're going to build in the ability to raise and lower the action at will. And the second one that comes out of it is what I call the high E bends. So you might not have any, you really can't stop this rattling. I can't anyway. No, the bridge is rattling, but you have to filter it out with your ear. So let's say we didn't find any choked notes that are typical of fret buzz. We didn't. They're all playing, but it's this bridge buzzing. But let's say oh, that's interesting. That's stuck in place, and that it was freewheeling, which is why it was making a noise. And that's a bit odd that we can move this up and down, and yet that stays where it is. That's because it's locked in place with a little locking nut. Okay, gotcha. So no, we didn't find any fret buzz from individual high or low frets. The next thing I look for is what I call the chokes, the bend chokes on the high E. And it's typical that you hear it starts to go zzz. Starts to zizz, and then if it's not good, it'll choke. Now, in this case, it is pretty good. Now I know that Chris has leveled these frets himself, and what I'm hearing is this little zizz, which is like a halfway to choking out, is not unlivable with, but it's probably the difference between the method he used to level it and the method I'm using. Let's say if he did the leveling with the neck, the strings off and the neck flattened with a truss rod adjustment, then that will have leveled it 100% while it was in that situation or that condition. Then you put it under load with the strings on, tighten the strings up to pitch, and the neck not only bends under load, but it also compresses from one end to the other, and it's that compression that can cause that little extra zizzing. So we've got no dead notes, no individual bad fret buzz. We've got marginal bend choke, and it usually chokes as we go into the G area, the G track as I call it. So I'll keep that in mind as I level it. We've got some almost chokes, not many, but we can see if we can free up, get rid of that zzz. And then the third kind of fret noise we get is what I call fret slap, which is zzz, 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 zzz. You hear that trailing? It's like a trailing buzz. Now the reason I call it slap and not buzz is because its cause is slightly different. Whereas the individual fret buzz is caused by one single fret that's high or low, the fret slap I have found out over the years, and this is why it comes into the what I've learned section of learning in the new ebook. And over the years what I've learned is that this other kind of buzz, which accompanies a note all the way up, big chunks, sometimes the whole of the neck, is caused by the neck's undulations. So when under load, the neck compresses and it puts a nice smooth neck, actually puts it into a sort of a series of hills and valleys. And you can't really see it with your eyes, but first of all, this fret slap, as I call it, tells me we've got that. And when we come to level, the leveling beam will show us where there are peaks, and those peaks will account for why it's making that funny buzz. And strangely enough, that buzz, even if they're like, if the buzz goes all the way up here, it's often because there's a high cluster of frets, 2 or 3 here, and then there'll be a high cluster up there, which we'll discover as we go through. And it's taking the tops of those hills down and bringing them kind of towards the valleys a little bit. All it does is it creates a tiny bit more space for the strings to move and alleviates what I call the fret slap. So there's the 3 things that I'm looking for. It's the individual choke notes, symptomatic of a high or a low fret. That's kind of familiar. There's the bend chokes, which pretty much always bend when they hit the G track, and that just means that as we're leveling in the G track, we're aiming to just eke out whatever's slightly high here, not high enough to make an individual note choke, but it's high enough to choke out the high E bend as it encroaches into the G track. And then finally on the wound strings, getting worser if you like as you go into the fatter strings, we've got this thing I call fret slap. Okay, so that's the end of that little section. So now we're going to get ready to move on. Okay, so now we're moving on. We're back in the setup. So what we're going to do, nicely out of tune now. So what I'm going to do is, I think what I want to do, what I want to do now is I'm going into section after section. I'm going to take the strings off. This is a new bone nut by the look of it. Actually, it could have been a Tusq. It's gone that yellow sort of colour. So what I'd like to do at this point, and what I typically do, is I'm going to take the string butler off, and that means taking the load off here and taking one of these tuners off. I'm going to take the string butler off, and I'm going to replace the nut at this point. So let's just get all these strings out of the way, and then because what I'd like to do before I do any leveling is I like to get the guitar in the sort of in the playing action that I want. So this means taking undoing these 2 strings a bit more. They should hopefully go back on. If they don't, we'll use the other strings to load them up again. If they break, I mean, but they shouldn't do. So the string butler is a good idea for the Gibson headstock, and one of the things that everybody believes is that the Gibson headstock is inherently flawed, and in many ways you can fairly say that it is. And the reason for that is if you go back, let's take an example of a more perfect headstock design, and we take the Strat for example. Now the Strat was designed deliberately, not accidentally but deliberately, so that the strings go through the nut at exactly 90 degrees or perpendicular to the nut. So when Fender designed it, he made sure that the tuners go in whatever position they are required to go in order to keep the strings running straight through the nut, to put as little tension on the nut as the strings went through the slots, and therefore to create as little friction as is humanly possible. And that was a very good design, and it's worked extremely well for a long while. Now we've got a little extra shim under here which I'm going to take off, which comes with the thing. What's the thing? The string butler. Anyway, so that was the smartest design ever. And then guitars, somewhere along the line, they started before they made guitars with this sort of open book headstock, and as a result, look at that, that's crushed the finish either side. Can you see that? Oh, maybe you can't. Let's have a quick close-up look. So that's put some heavy duty. That may have gone on after the repair. They may have done some finishing of the top here, and that might have put some fresh finish on, because those little washers seem to have really gone down heavy on the wet lacquer. But we don't know. It's hard to say. Where's my mirror? Where's my mirror? Here it is. The mirror is always good. Now, what did I say I was going to do? Oh yes, the nut thing, and I've got to start again with a new thing. But I was just going to prepare this first. So we've got the thing off there and the thing here, and we will put that back on, do this back up. While the strings are off, I will take the nut off, and we'll start getting ready for the next section. But we'll cut to our new learning segment, our ebook segment. Another one, Chris, I'm sorry. You feel like a guinea pig being used. Case study. Right, let's draw on our clapperboard what it is. I feel so efficient getting this right. Stay there, stay there. And I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, this one coming up will be called CO3, making and fitting adjustable Tusq nut with 3D printed base. Right, so then I stop this, come along. So in this section C3 of the new techniques that I've put into action since I've been doing this, or what I've learned to do over the last 8 years or so, and that is to fit an adjustable Tusq nut. Now when I started doing this, I would make the bases myself, but this one is going to show you how to do it with a 3D printed base, but I will do a couple more videos showing how to make them with a resin or a milliput, which I got some in of. Ta-da! And I'll show you how that works in another video, but this one's for the 3D printed nut. So what I do is I'll show you the components. Well, maybe I'll tell you the quick bit of the backstory. Gibson had a terrible reputation for tuning stability, and so quite sensibly, I mean, partly because of the spread of the strings, so that the strings have to go out at quite extreme angles, particularly the D and the G. And because of that spread, and because people actually generally are terrible about stretching their strings anyway, those two things together, but particularly if you like the sideways angles of the strings, those really help to make sure that the guitar would go out of tune all the time. And so Gibson thought of, eventually probably got tired of complaints and decided to come up with a solution. So what they made was a 0 fret nut, and I'll sort of draw crudely what it looked like, if I can. So that sort of thing. So they made there's the fingerboard. They made a cradle that kind of sat into the, let's go like that. There's a headstock. Yeah, does that make sense? Let's zoom out a bit. And there's the first fret. Yeah, right. So they made a cradle, and then what they did was, how did they do it? I can't remember. They made a kind of an insert that went into the middle of that, kind of like that. I'm making it up. And in here there was a grub screw that sat in there like that. And basically there were slots in here, so your string came up into that like at the back end of an old Echo acoustic, where they have a plastic nut, and the plastic nut just guides the string, keep them apart, and then the string came over the top of this piece of brass here, which was a 0 fret, and off it went down over the first fret, and you got a nice low for action. Of course, you could raise it or lower it on this little grubbed screw, and that was a very, very, very clever idea. Except the problem is, as anyone who's owned a 0 fret guitar will eventually find out, or actually not, won't take them long to find out, is that regardless of what the 0 fret, this bit here, is made of, a steel-based or a metal-based string sitting on top of that 24/7 will cause it to notch, even without you playing it. So before you know what's happened, your surface will develop this little notch. There's your kind of vertical thing, a little notch in there like that, and the string will kind of sit in there, and it will just develop it by just sitting there. And as soon as you start doing bends anywhere near that end of the guitar, it'll go click, click, really annoyingly as you go from side to side. So it became obvious that was a problem, and of course, as I say, that will happen even if that piece is made of stainless steel. It is such a power, or there's so much force wearing on the down on that surface there, that it will notch. There's nothing you can do about it. I've seen new guitars with 0 frets that are notched from the time they've been sitting in the distributor or the retailers. Nobody's even played them and they're notched. So what happened was, everyone was thrilled that they made this new, I think they called it a 0 glide nut, but they clearly very quickly became obvious they had a problem. I think Gibson went away, and their solution was to come up with a titanium, this part titanium. So they left the brass kind of cradle in there, and they either sold or replaced them all with a titanium insert, which is still it's a much better solution. But in the intervening period, those clever people in Canada, Graphtec, the makers of Tusq, came up with a solution. And the interesting thing is that they made a piece to fit into the cradle that Gibson had made, but instead of following the 0 fret principle, the replacement they came up with used Tusq with its pre-lubricated qualities, gave it the adjustability as you can see here, but their idea was that sitted, dropped into the cradle, and reverted it to a familiar standard nut, but capable of being raised and lowered. So it was a really good solution. Now that was on the market for a couple of years, and until I kind of came across it by accident once. And as soon as I saw it, I'd been a stickler for getting nuts right for the longest while, and I used to spend forever cutting first frets on guitars to get the nut right. I realized it was such an important part of the thing. Then when I saw this thing, I realized if I could just make a base for it, I could use this on this kind of guitar, and any kind, not just a Gibson. I could fit this on the end of every guitar I wanted, 3 aside. So what I first did was I made some bases out of milliput and different resins, and they were hard work, and eventually a very kind friend contacted me, a follower of Reloved, and offered to make me some in 3D printing terms, which he did, and now I use those, but I'll show you in another video how to make them out of a resin if you haven't got a 3D printer. So let's go ahead and I'll show you the process I go through now, and we'll do it in live for real, replace this on the Gibson. Now in the Gibson we have to just make sure we see what's what. There is a little bit of resin that's been painted over. It could have been done, I think, at the time of the repair as well. So I'm just going to just very carefully, gently have a look at scoring down the front. Now there's a lot of people have different views about this. People think that somehow you just touch this with your scalpel and everything will fall apart without any fight or any tears at all. It isn't the case. Really all I'm cutting for at this point is to break the the finish, so that it doesn't flake off in huge chunks when I come to remove the nut. And it's impossible to do it without there being some signs of it. It's just, you know, you can't do invisible stuff. It's a myth. So all I'm doing is I'm just using, as carefully as I can, I'm just guiding, cutting into the resin, no, I keep saying resin, into the lacquer, just so that we break it where we want it broken, at the bottom of the nut fit, and not anywhere else. And it's quite difficult to do, but with care and patience you can do it. Okay, and then you come to the tapping part of the game, which is where we hope that the previous person who's put this nut on hasn't used an absolute ton of super glue. Now we'll find out fairly soon. Now this does feel quite tightly fixed. So I'm giving it a couple of little taps, and I'm not in the slightest bit convinced this is going to play ball, so I'm not even going to take any risks. Do you hear? I don't want to be tapping this sideways, forwards. I can do it one tiny tap sideways, and if it doesn't move in the sideways direction, then I'm not going to carry on whacking it to try and persuade it. If it doesn't move in the first go, then what I will end up doing is I will end up cutting it off. Now people get really freaky scared when I go to do that. No, it doesn't want to move. It doesn't show any sign of wanting to move. So I'm going to do the bit that scares Gibson owners. I'm going to take a Dremel to it, and I've done this 1,000 times before, so don't ye panic. You have to it's safer to revert to a destructive method than to try and, for no good reason, to try and save the original nut. If it's stuck in tightly, which this is, you want it out safely. So hold your ears. So you can see, get this fly out of my hair. So you can see, we're just cutting away at the tusk, or the new bone. And what we can do at this point is we could look at breaking it off inwards like so. And out comes a chunk. And we do the same again. And again. Oh, fly, get off me. There we are. So that's just a start point, just so we can see better where we're going. Now the idea is we'll carry on cutting. Fly. And then we can get a hammer or a tap. What we're going to use, not that one, this one. We'll just tap it inwards now. That's moving now. There we go. Big chunk. What is this bone? It's interesting stuff. I'm not quite sure what it is. Right, we'll get one of these, and we'll just see if we can lever that bit out. Okay, so that's nice. We've got the bulk of it out, and then there's just a bit of cleaning up to do along the back edge there. So, despite a load of noise and scary dust and so on, it's a very safe and dependable way of doing it, which I've done many a time and oft. And then we can just convince these bits to come out like so. There we go. Okay, so that's nicely cleaned up. Just a little bit of work, I would say, to do with a blade. So at this point there's so much glue there's no way that was coming out. Let's see if you can see, because some people go, oh, you should have just tapped that and it should have come out sideways, drifted it. Look at the amount of glue. Look how thick that glue is along the back edge of there, right? There's not a chance. There's about 0.5 millimetre thick of glue. Can you see it? There's no way that was going to come off without doing what I did. So in case anyone's going to have that old grizzly, complainy sort of thing. Now the difficult part of this is, having done that, you have to sort of clean up this edge. And unfortunately, although we've got files that are great for doing the horizontal flat part of the nut slot shelf, it doesn't do the face of the end of the fingerboard still. So what I'm doing anyway, just to begin with, I'm just flattening out the bottom of the nut slot, and the same here. Now it may be I can clean up some of this. If I can't, we may have to sort of live with more of it on the face, but we'll have a look. Now I've got my 3D printed thingy here, and sounds like we've got it is swallows out there, but they're sounding like parrots. So here we've got the 3D printed base, and I cut a very small sliver of brass and fit it in there and put it in there like that. Now it just gives the bottom of the that thing, the base, a little bit of extra strengthening, because as you probably figure out, when I move this around, the grub screws on the here will press into the material, whatever it's standing in. Now I do a couple of things to minimize the effect of that. The first one is I'm going to dial these grub screws back in, and I'm going to flatten them out on a sanding block to basically just flatten out the actual foot of the grub screw. And once I've flattened it out, then it'll also then stand on the brass strip as well, which is only 1/4 millimetre thick, but it will do a pretty good job in helping strengthen the plastic, the 3D plastic underneath. So there we go. I've just flattened the grub screws, and I'm just sanding them to flush. And if you can see there, sort of slightly shiny. Then I put this together with this, and I clip them together, and there's my unit. Now I'll keep this up because I'll need it. So just for now, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, if I can zoom in, hello there, I'm going to just place this in here and see, okay, we're quite a bit wider to begin with, so where's the original? Oh, the original's got eaten up, so we're going to have to do this by Couldn't measure the nut, that's a shame. So I'm going to have to do this by, not by eye, but we're going to have to just work it down to size. So key thing about this now will be getting this to thickness. So if I move the guitar sideways, moving all the other equipment out of the way, then I can get myself space for the sanding board. Now this is vital part. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm talking about thinning the whole piece down before we get into height adjustment. So the first thing I'm going to do is sand this against its face flat and take some material. Now you can see it makes a mess of it, but that's only because it's on already a dirty piece of sandpaper, so it will clean up as we go. So that's the first thing, and then I want to sand again, and I want to keep it perpendicular face to the bottom, so it's quite a tricky thing about keeping the Tusq part cutting a bit more than the plastic, because it's quite easy to go the other way. So it's a matter of sanding this down to fit, and obviously I'll be kind of homing in on the right thickness. So I'm going to do it front and back, because we're going to take as much off either side as each other, and because we want the grub screws to end up being placed firmly in the middle. So that's that, and again I've got my other bits of stuff here which I can use for the clean up sand to get a good look at it, like so. So what I'll do is I'll eventually sand this down to the thickness of the original, and it will fit in, which it isn't doing yet. It's actually quite a narrow nut, that one, but we'll get it down to that same thickness and then concentrate on the height adjustment. And the height adjustment in many ways is the easier part, because I know what the target I'm aiming for is. So I'm just working broad strokes at the moment. Now this is, a fair bit of, can be a fair bit of work to get this to the correct size, and it's worth, my experience is worth doing, because once you've got this fitted, this will work so well that it won't need a that thing, String Butler. So this is going to be give you a really good tuning stability without the need for that ugly extra, but useful, extra component. Okay, so normally I'd probably go off camera at this point saying I'll come back to you when this is done, because it's quite a big, long, as you can see, boring set of sanding to get it right. But since I'm doing this as here's what I've learned since the last ebook, I better follow it through in detail. So sanding is always a kind of experience-based thing. It's just good to do lots of sanding of things to size, because you get better at it the more you do. Simple as that. If you don't practice sanding, or you just go at it cold, you can end up costing yourself need for a new component here and there, because you can either over sand it or ruin it. But when you're sort of fairly clear about what you want, it's good to have built up the experience. Nearly there. Now of course, as I get closer to being in the right place, obviously I want to start slowing down on the scale and the amount of my sanding. I don't want to overcut and end up with a mess. And sanding block like this is your dear friend, I promise you. It's so important. And the flatter, the more dependable, the better. Okay, getting there. Ooh, yes, right, now we'll switch sides and we'll do the front side again. So it's taking quite a lot of the original nut away, but that's fine because we only need it to be only as wide as we need it. So it's just customizing it for the guitar in hand. And as I get closer to the mark, then I tend to concentrate on making sure the cutting is flat. So this one's now leaning a bit in favour of the Tusq side, so I need to just bring down the plastic a little bit to square it off. So I'm going to do that with a little bit of a bias towards the plastic side of the thing, and again sort of follow it with the thinner, milder paper, I should say. As long as you take it very carefully, you do get where you want to go in the end. We're almost on the mark. I'm just scraping off a bit of unwanted finish on that old nut slot. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to here and think about trying to just clean up the last few bits. Ooh, we're so close. Right, I'm looking at the balance. Okay, we've got a bit more we can take off this side. The swallows are playing around like crazy outside. They're having a fine old time. Half expecting to see one turn up in the workshop as I had before last year. One of them got confused and ended up in here. So I had to scoop him up with my human hands and invite him to leave. Right. So the material that this thing is made of is a bit odd. So as you get thinner, it does start to kind of cut through to some of its funny layers underneath, but it's still fine as long as it fits in and stays in place, which it will do. We're not really too worried about the sort of slightly weird fibrous quality of the print. We just want it to get it down to size to fit comfortably in. Just pulling up little strips there. And we're almost on the mark, so not far off. So I think what I'll do now is I'll get rid of this big board because I'm sort of sending myself the message that I'm in fine tuning now. You can see we are there, sort of thing. Okay, fine tuning. And there we go again. There's still a little bit to go. Where have we got room to take it from? And still from this side. Well, today we actually had to take in the hammocks today. Can you believe that? Because it said there was a 20% chance of rain. And it's actually, in the end, it didn't rain. But I kind of take the hammocks in. Must have been about 3 weeks solid, a month now, that it either hasn't rained or if it's rained briefly. Although, typical British person complaining about the grey weather and lack of sunshine, and as soon as it's kind of blindingly hot and dry, going, oh God, we need the rain to come and save the garden. It's dry as a bone, which it actually is. So, finally getting our way down to the last. If I scraped off that glue that's in there, I could probably fit that, but I don't like the thought of tacking the wall side of the end wall of the fretboard. It's quite difficult to get it off, believe it or not. Oh, it's so close, and yet so far. Oh, do you know what? I think I need to get rid of that stuff. A little bit difficult to work with. There's so much of it on there. Oh my god, I don't like that. I'm going to try and do it with a sort of guillotine approach. Ugh. See how much there is on there? There's a ton of glue. It's difficult. It's coming off in flakes, man. If you can, well, you can't see that because you're looking in the wrong. No, you can just about see that. Yeah, it's coming off in great flakes. The great flakes. Oh. Let's see if you can see up close. Rarely have I seen as much glue as that. That is substantial. Now, what's going to happen is I'm going to find that if I bleed and I get rid of this, things are going to fall in there and rattle around, isn't it? No, it's just going to fit in. Probably a good thing that I did this now. Oh, in you go. I'm digging a little bit now just to get it in and shift the bulk of it. Oh, you hear loads of sheep in this part of the country, and yet it's June. I mean, mid-June. I thought all the sheep were early spring creatures. So you can see that the process of doing this, wouldn't it be great if Gibson sold the frames, the cradles, if you like? That would be so wonderful. But the truth is, I've never contacted them and said, would you sell it to me? Wow, that is a messy pile of glue, if ever I saw one, and it's clogged right up into the corner there. Like this crusty gunge, and it's down at the bottom there as a little ledge. Wow. Well, probably should have done that first. And there we go. Almost perfect fit. Do a little bit of crust removal down here. We should be on the mark. Yeah, so the amount of time dedicated to the nut is something that I learned the importance of when I started doing this, and it's something I would never skimp on again. Hence the focus on the adjustable nut, and spending plenty of time doing it. So this won't quite sit down again. It could be because there's still a bit of glue crusted up on this side, but it's actually a little bit harder to get on this side because it's such a short piece of surface. So this is what you end up having to fight with after somebody's put a nut in and glued it in, made sure it's not going to go anywhere, and of course the problem you've got after that is it doesn't go anywhere, which is good in one way but not so good in another. Right, and when you finally get there, hurrah! Da 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 da. Oops, sorry, that's just about done. What I'm going to make sure is I'm going to go just down into this corner here, to make sure it's squared off and will fit, and there's not anything blocking the way. So yeah, worth putting the effort into as I get to the end of the setup in a minute, I tend to talk about the components of tuning stability on your guitar, and that applies as much to a Gibson. There's not a glue spilt over the top here from past nut fitting. It's kind of raised up. Yeah, the thing about tuning stability applies as much to a Gibson as any guitar, and it's down to the nut, the setting of the nut on sorry, it's about the quality of the nut and the amount of slack that you have left in your strings, and we're taking care of the nut aspect now by making sure that it's a Tusq one. It sets the action, first fret action, at the exact correct height or depth, and yeah, it's adjustable so we can get it to the exact right depth. So that fits in beautifully. Now what I'm seeing is there's a lift here in the laminate on the top here isn't fixed down, so I think it's trying to move. Yeah, it's trying to lift up as this comes through. So that probably needs a bit of a little bit of, well, it won't need glue, but it just needs to be, it needs the nut to be just a tiny fraction thinner, so it doesn't put pressure on this piece of, what do you call it? What did I call it? Veneer, because it appears to be just slightly loose at that point, probably as a result of the earlier breakage. Now, see, it's as long as it's slightly loose fitting, it will be fine, but if it puts pressure on this, it's going to try and pull it out. So basically it means the end of this slot is a bit narrower, so as the nut goes in to the correct thickness, it's putting pressure on this edge here, and it rises upwards because there's no extra room. Typical, it's got longer winded than I'd hoped for. Yeah, so I don't have, that doesn't fit in there, does it? No, that's too narrow. I've got a sanding stick that will do, not to hand, that's too wide. And the thing I've got hasn't got any sanding substance on it for doing the sides, because it's actually narrow here. It's going to be very difficult to do this very end bit, I'm afraid. Fraction, but it works if I press it down. Does it? No, it's still going to try and pull that up. So I either thin down one end of this thing slightly more than the other, which I'm going to do, and if I can, maybe put a tiny bit of glue on that laminate that's lifting. Right, that's pretty much, that's actually on almost, that's pretty much on the mark actually. Right, now you can see that's a beautiful fit, and what I'm going to do now is here's what we want to do normally. So when I put this on, we get the front face facing the right way, which is there. Put it on, press it down, and then the idea is we will hook up the strings, and obviously I already know this is going to end up being too tall, so we're going to need to make an adjustment, but let's just put the strings on to begin with, so you can see what we're aiming for. You come on over the top, right. There you go. There you go. So you can see that you've got this nice spacing, 35mm, same as the original, but now you can see that currently it's way too tall. So we're going to have to take off a fair bit of the base, and as it happens, if that base is too tall full stop, then what we can do is we can replace it with a narrower or shallower base that I've got here. Let me just check that, see if there's a quicker way to this. We'll put this as the front, take this off, take out our little piece of brass if we can, thank you, fit it in here, same, nice fit, insert the thing, and let's see, this will be obviously too wide on this, so we can take this one down, but the question is it the right sort of height? Well, if it is, it might be a good quick way to where we want to get to. So this is a little bit trickier because I'm now doing this without, hopefully without touching the Tusq part of it. Do both sides. It's quite difficult to get the same thickness. It's probably be better to try and do it without the thing in it. But it's again quite difficult because it's much more flexible. So I've got two sizes. I've got a tall one and a short one. So I should have probably just done a visual comparison to begin with and gone short. But we should be able to assess this. If we get close, we should be able to level them out. Close, not yet. So, what I'm questioning is how much of the base of this I need to take out, and it's probably a fair bit. I'm trying to think which is the quickest way, either taking the base off that other one or just thinning this one down. Come on. I think it's probably this one is probably the quickest way. Scaling down the shorter one. Yeah, we can get that down just about flush before we start cutting on the Tusq itself, which we don't really want to do. We just want to square it off flush with the Tusq, which is quite difficult to do that without hitting the Tusq. So this is a bit longer than I would have intended to take, only because Gibsons are a little bit different from other things. Once this is done, the fret leveling will look like a cinch by comparison. Are we nearly flush, nearly flush, nearly flush, nearly flush, nearly flush. Stay. Nearly flush. Nearly. It'd be good if we could do this manually, but I don't think we can, not without some damage. Well, maybe we can a bit. Yeah, close. close. Let's do this side as well. It's not a bad way to do it. Keep a track on it quite well. Getting there, nearly there. Okay, flatten it out now. Don't stick. That's nearly on there, and here's the front. Let's try it in there. Again, a little bit tight at the far end, but actually that's workable. Okay, so there we go. That was the quicker of the two routes. Okay, so what I'm going to do, ready for the next stage, but obviously we won't be technically talking about it right now, but I'm going to just paint the frets ready for the fret leveling. But now we're just going to confirm, test and confirm the nut replacement with our adjustable Tusq. So the idea of sizing it now is to get it to sit in the slot, and we want the strings to begin with the nut fully down inside its case. We want the strings to sit on the first fret, so don't worry about the dust and everything. So that's good. There we go. That's sitting on the first fret. That's sitting on this. You see, if I've gone too short a one, it might mean that it has to come up too high, in which case we have to go back to the original one, and it's just a little bit hard to know until we get stuck in. But we'll know any minute now when I tighten these up. So in a sense it's doing well at this point. It's starting with the strings firmly on the first fret, which is sort of where we want to go. But let's see if we can raise it up with just a small amount of movement now. What we don't want to do is put the thing up on its stilts. So if it has to go that far up, we may be better off going for the taller piece and bringing it down. Difficult to know because it's quite hard to measure the slot. Sort of helps to get the original nut out without having to break it, but that isn't possible, as you saw. Okay, here we go. So let's get these on. Get this on its saddle there, and its saddle there. Boink, and the saddle there, and the other one. Right, so I don't really need these too tight, other than I want the pressure to be on them somewhat. Okay, right, now you should be able to see the next thing I'm going to do is dial up our action up to there, and we're just getting the lift up to the right place. We're getting more on the bass side, that's alright. That's all good. Now, since we're going to do the leveling anyway, let's get the thing in tune and see how it sits. I think that's going to be okay. Perfect. Ta-da! There we are. Okay, so now I'm going to stop this segment, have a drink, come back when we'll do the fret leveling. See you in a minute. Okay, so we're on another little segment for the ebook here called section B01, and this is just I want to make a distinction between a couple of tools, or the tool I used to use and the tool I now use. So this is about tools and techniques that have changed since 2016 when I started using this method of leveling. So when I began using this kind of leveling, the innovation, I suppose, was simply that I was leveling with the neck loaded and curved. So, but it's important to keep in mind loaded and curved. Now it's only curved because it's loaded, right? And I think some methods and some jigs and stuff that people make to try and simulate loading and the correct playing way to set things up. They simulate, or they reproduce curve, but they don't simulate this compression that's happening right now because the guitar is loaded and the strings are pulling end to end. And in fact, I had an email come in today. I don't suppose I can even get to it. It wasn't an email, it was no, I don't think I'll see it. Somebody wrote, I explained my method in a previous video, and they wrote in saying it made exactly the difference between their original method of doing the leveling with the neck flat and the strings off, and they kept finding when they restrung it, it still wasn't quite right, and still had more buzz and stuff or slap to level out. And then they did it with the banana method and found that the compression, additional bunching of the neck under compression, made all the difference. So anyway, when I started, I wasn't really thinking of fret slap, I only was thinking of leveling. So any uneven frets, and so I began with this one, or a tool like this that came out of a Squire Strat neck. How well you can see that. And it's I think I featured it a lot in the original ebook, and it's a sort of one way, I suppose you call it. You bend it, tighten it, and it curves in a positive bend. You slack it off and it goes flat, but there's no opposite way around. If you keep on turning it, the end falls off, like so. So that wasn't, that was absolutely fine, and that did a lot of good work. And in fact, it's so much better than the flat method of leveling. And this was great. The advantage of this one was that it's very thin, so it's about 5 or 6 mils maximum wide, and so that as far as taking chunks, or not chunks is the right word, slices of the radius. So if we think about the radius of the guitar neck, there's your fret looking end on. People sometimes say, well, if you're going up and down with beams, aren't you going to impose a flat spot? Now, I've actually seen StewMac recommending the use of a beam that's about that big relative to the radius. In fact, even bigger. It's a great big. It was perhaps as big as that, or even that thing I was just leveling with. Yeah, kind of great big sanding beam looking a bit like this. Right. So imagine that. Hoping to level your frets. Now, thinking about it, that is a terrible way to do it, because you're going to, if you're unlucky, you're going to put flat spots on, and you're going to end up with a radius that kind of looks like that by the time you're finished, which is not exactly smooth. So one of the things that I noticed straight away was that to use a very thin leveling beam like this was the equivalent of, let's put the strings on as if we had the E, the B, the G, the D, A, and the E. That's obviously exaggerated, but when I use that one, I would use one to go across that whole sort of area there, and then I'd use the same one to go across the area there, and the flat one, technically flat, but I would go from side to side, and you could see that the radius, or the banana, would work in 6 different and slightly side to sidey type slices across the radius. So it was you know, the better, the smaller, thinner the beam, the less flattening effect it will have on the radius. That's the way to put it. And so this original one is great for that because it's only about 5 millimeters thick width. Now later on, when I discovered that actually I was doing something else called, really I was working with this thing that I titled, or I named, called fret slap. When I started to realize that fret slap was the result of, I've drawn this out in a couple of other of these sections, so it'll be a repeat, but what happened is, under this method, you didn't get a neck that bent like that under load. What in fact happens with the neck is it goes like this, exaggerated. Right? It goes in a series of little hills and things. And so what I was finding is this new thing I called fret slap was the result not of individual high or low frets, which is what causes what I'm calling the source of fret buzz, but fret slap is a kind of rattle that seems to come from the spinning strings. If you think about the wound strings spinning kind of like this, or more, you know, they're basically clipping these high areas here and here and different parts of the neck, and that's because of the hills and valleys, or it's the hills that are the problem. And what I discovered with experimentation, it wasn't really on purpose, but what I found was I realized that if we had a neck that was like that, an imperfect curve, and what we were doing with the leveling system is we were taking like a digital sample of that complicated uneven curve, and we were reproducing it in a much smoother and more progressive curve, which was this beam. So we basically made the beam kind of look like that. That's maybe an exaggeration, but actually it's not a bad description of it. So you can see that the one underneath is what I call imperfect, and that's the real life of the neck. It is imperfect, and it has a variety of hills and valleys in different clusters, and the beam was much more perfect. And so we got this perfect because we used 3 sample points, which is what I call a very low resolution sample. Of course it's not copying the neck. In truth, it's not copying it accurately. What it's doing is it's taking a very crude median between these 3 points as its sample size, and so it makes this kind of I suppose you could call it an average curve that says if you averaged out, let's try it with a blue, it's saying if you averaged out the ups and downs on this neck, it would sort of come between them all a bit like that, right? So that's a pretty useful thing, because once we get that perfect curve into there, the next thing that follows, and I discovered this over time, is that if you impose that gently on the unevenness of the underlying fretboard, so again, let's go back to the fretboard with its clusters of highs and lows, very badly done. But don't forget that on that fretboard are a series of frets, and they get perhaps closer together as you go further up. There's a terrible fretboard, very exaggerated. But then, if we look at our perfect curve that we've sampled, which is we know is a median across those 3 sample points, if we now imagine lowering that onto this hills and valleys thing, we know we're going to basically snip off a bit of those highs there, going to even it out, snip off a bit there, take off quite a bit there. Obviously it's exaggerated, we're not going to scoop the bleeding fingerboard, but you know what I'm saying. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to impose, and that's the word I keep using in my videos, we're going to impose this perfect curve onto the fretboard, the imperfect curve of the fretboard. And in doing so, what it does is it, if you like, it cuts out those horrible bits a little bit, not it's tiny amounts, but if you imagine that's what it ended up doing, right? And what it does is it clears up a little bit of room for the low wound strings to spin. And I found that technique seems to do this third type of buzz, or the fret slap that I've called it. And what's great is when I discovered that, or I stumbled on that. What I realized was that for that to work, this one, the thin one, was perfect for getting rid of the individual high or low frets, and I used it for a year or something. But this one, this U-channel truss rod, which is a Martin style one, and you can get them from somewhere in the UK, and I think Tone Tech Luthiers and Supplies in the UK probably has them, but they're Hosco Martin style ones, and they're a stiff-ish aluminium U-box shaped thing with a truss rod in the middle, and basically the advantage of this is it's stiffer, simple as that. So when you come to impose that perfect curve on the imperfect curve, you don't want a lot of force, and you certainly don't want this to bend and map to the shape of your imperfect neck. You want this curve to sit on top of it and gently impose itself. So the stiffer this curve is at that point, the better. And I started to find that this device kept that curve better. Now the downside is it's twice as wide. If you think about it coming across the radius, it's twice as wide as the original one, but it's not. It doesn't really have that much of an impact. There's no real negative impact. In my mind, I would like it to have been thinner, but I would trade off the thickness, the stiffness of this one anytime. Now, having said that, we're ready to level. So I've explained the difference, and I'm going to stop and restart. Chris, I'm sorry, you'll think your video, your guitar was nothing but an excuse to get my content from my ebook. Oh, look at this. CO1 12-inch. So this is, what is this? This is New Techniques. Yeah, New Techniques CO1 12-inch radius. So what I'm looking at here is how I go about leveling out fret buzz and bend chokes. So interestingly, I'm going to go through the motions, but this guitar, having checked it already, doesn't have it's not showing any class symptoms of any real individual spots of fret buzz, or for that matter any single fret chokes, other than the tiniest bit of zizz as I bend across into the G track on the high E bends. But let's go through it anyway, because this is what we're setting up. Chris's Gibson ES 335. And so we're going to do our banana work as now. This part of this ebook is mainly for people who've used this method before, so I don't have to kind of explain everything about it. You know what we're doing. We're using this adjustable truss rod on a neck that is both slightly curved, relieved, and under compression, so it's being pulled end to end. I'm just going to check something. I'm happy with the action. I measured it out before. Let me just make sure that it's not too ridiculously too low, because I'd be sort of flogging a dead horse if it was too low. It is pretty low, I have to say. That's about barely 1.5, and we're actually touching the. Chris has already got this down to my target action, so let's just work with it. And the relief we checked before. Now this is annoying me because this isn't sat fully down in its slot. That doesn't want to go down. I think we're going to need to pull that out. Well, we'll do it afterwards. That's why that side didn't have to go up so much. Okay, we'll take that afterwards. Let's just do our thing now. We'll come back to that and readjust that afterwards. Right, so the relief is very slight, but again, it's a flat neck, low action. It's already playing pretty well as is, but we're going to do the final refined final touches. So here we go. We've calibrated the thingy, that thing. Now I'm just going to look at this. I'm conscious that these are sticking up, and I don't want to clip them with any beam that I'm using, so I am going to dial them down, and I know they're pretty high up, so we know where to go at the end. It's almost way right up under the strings. Just as a note, as a general rule of thumb, the idea is that the closer to the strings you go, you put your pickup poles, the greater the output from the pickup, but the lesser the tonal dynamics. The further away from the strings the poles are, the lower the output, but the greater the tonal dynamics. So it's your choice, but those were very close. So I think quite a lot of aficionados would say, oh no, that's going for the output, not the beautiful tone. So I'm doing the leveling in. I'm looking for uneven frets that are causing any fret buzz. So I've checked it, and there isn't any obvious fret buzz. So I'm expecting a fairly even set of frets right from the outset, and that's what I'm finding. And the reason I know that is it's pretty cool to be able to tell. I don't know how well this looks from here. As you can see, let me find the light from my angle. It's cutting, more. So a highish spot there, higher, high one, it's sort of lumpy in the middle a little tiny bit, lowering down and low at the end. So it's a pretty good all-round neck, not a lot of ups and downs, but there's a lower spot at the end and a couple of higher points along the way. But it sort of confirms what I know about having felt it so far, that it's pretty good. And when we're leveling for buzz, what we're always listening to is the individual notes. That's the first thing we check. So pretty good. I'll just do a little bit at this end to see if I can level out that, or bring these frets closer together, as they seem to have, maybe somebody's put some fall away or fall off deliberately into the end there. What I found good about this banana method, particularly when we do that thing of imposing the perfect action onto the imperfect, or the perfect curve onto the imperfect curve, I don't ever need to put fall away in. It seems to take care of it all itself. Okay, so I'm happy with that. That's all I'm going to take on that line, and I'm going to use the same calibration for the B track and move the string. Again, I'm not going into the absolute basics of this. I'm thinking about more of this for people reading this ebook. I'm thinking about more of this as an advanced the advanced steps. So it's more about, how do you know things like, why not do some more leveling on that first track? Well, they're all cutting up, the guitar's playing pretty well to begin with, and there's no distinct individual frets that are either choking out, or either tall ones or short ones. Again, the second run confirms everything's more or less cutting evenly, so I'm not expecting any surprises, because these notes were all playing pretty well before. So this is just a sort of tweaking under compression. Happy with that. Now we had a little bit of zing in the G track, so now I'm going to calibrate for the G track, and at this point I'm kind of switching over in my mind to actually these have to be together, don't they? I just realized my two sections probably run in together. I'll stop the video anyway and restart, because I'm supposed to. I'm doing it proper. Yeah, so as we get to the G track, we're kind of in the zone where we're not thinking about individual fret buzz, because we haven't found any up to this point, so we're not expecting to see any individual high or low frets, because since we haven't surfaced any by playing. So at this stage I'm kind of thinking of fine-tuning any of the frets around the G track, and that maybe just slightly threatening choke and going into the slight zing sound just before choking. So this is the G track. It's the all-important G track actually, and it's the last bit where it's the step before I start thinking about fret slap. I'm still on sort of choke and buzz, but right on the G here I'm thinking about choke and buzz only from the bend perspective now, the high E bends, and it's usually somewhere up here that you get the problem, because as you get up to the top there, you're running out of running out of clearances. So I'm just going to check out all the individual notes. It's still vital to do. The only place I'm getting it to make any sort of ziz is on the far side of the G track close to me. So I'm going to do one more little level in that track, but I'm going to sort of focus on the side nearest me, closer to the D than the G. So we're kind of going ahead of ourselves a little bit now. And now the experience part of it says to me it's such a small amount of ziz, and so not quite into the choking department now. That's the only leveling I'm going to do to it. It's just a notional token bit of leveling to see if we can just ease that. The amount of leveling I just did there, I know for a fact that if that doesn't clear that little zzz as I'm trying to bend it, then nothing will at that action, because ultimately the bends are dictated by the radius, the geometric limitations of the radius. And an example of that, I did a video about this once, which I thought was quite a fair way of describing it. It's hard to be, and some people have argued the opposite of this, so it's not gospel. But if you think about, if you look at the neck from the end, and there's your cross section, and you've got your sort of E, your B, your G, your D, your A, and your E, right, low E over here. So when you're bending, and let's say this is your fret, okay, and you're bending, and that's your neck, whatever, and you're bending a string, and you think about it, you are, actually it's quite good to do this in 3D, so there's your neck in perspective, right? Ta-da! So, and here's the small version of it down there, and here's the big version of it down the other end. So if you think about this as your nut down here, that's a bad way of writing it. When you bend your E string, you're bending it in space. So you're bending from, if the E's down here, it normally runs all the way down there, and you're bending it up a hill to there, and then it comes back down. And if you look at that end on in 3D, dead on in 3D, it's starting here, it's coming up to here, and then it's coming back down to there. And that, the tighter that is, the more that gets in the way. It's really hard to describe, but it's because you're pushing it up a hill, which means that when you're thinking of the frets in between this and the bridge, they're sticking up, and your string has got to come across them and go back down a 3D hill looking at in plan end view. So it's this geometric thing that causes it to choke out. Ultimately, with a certain low action and a certain tight radius, there is no amount of leveling you can do to get rid of that. It's as simple as that. You are stuck with the constraints of the radius. So 7¼ inch radius, the classic vintage radius, sometimes you just can't do it on a, if you want a 1.5 millimeter down to 1.2 on the last low E down to the high E, which I tend to, that's my lowest target action. Sometimes you can't get that on a 7.25. You may have to go to like 1.75 on the low E and 1.5 on the high E, and a gradient in between. From 9.5, you should be able to get the 1.5 and the 1.2 spread on the last fret measurements across all the strings. And so if you know that and you have experience of that, then that knowledge can give you quite a good confidence start point, because there's nothing about any guitar, nothing about this. I know it's an expensive Gibson compared to a budget guitar or whatever, but there's nothing about this that beats that or changes the basics, which is, if this is a 12-inch roughly radius, then I should be able to get 1.5 easily and a 1.2. I say easily. We should be able to get 1.5 over to 1.2 at the last fret. And then what Chris has actually got here is he got it slightly lower. And it's a 12-inch radius, so it's more forgiving in that respect than is a 9.5 or certainly a 7.5. You'd never get it that low with a 7.25. Okay, so I'm going to stop this one and we'll get on to the next section of this neck under a different module. So So in this section of the ebook, we are in new techniques, and this is C02 12-inch. So we're leveling out fret slap on a 12-inch radius neck, and our model in this case is Chris's Gibson ES 335. We've done the E, the B, the G, and now we're coming on to the first of the wound strings, the D. So at this stage we carry on as normal in calibrating. So we calibrate the banana leveling file as normal for the D track in this case, and let's see how it works. And again, I'm not going to explain exactly how this calibration is working, because this is for people who've used this method before. But what's to note here is that we've moved from fret buzz and fret bend choke. Now we're thinking fret slap. So we've changed our mindset at this point as we hit the first of the wound strings. Now, of course, the thing we're doing here will still remove individual fret buzz. It will still take care of it, and it will still take care of any choking that might happen, because that's actually still about individual high or low frets. But what we're really thinking about now is we're thinking of the topography of the neck, those hills and valleys, and we're thinking about this perfect curve gently imposing itself onto that imperfect curve, because we know that this is now an average, an ideal, platonic ideal if you like, an average, an idealized average of that neck, not counting all its ups and downs. It's like a median curve. And as we put it on here, the lighter we place it on here, the more likely, if we don't press and distort the bar, the more likely it's going to gently impose its ideal curve onto the hills and valleys that are on this neck, and maybe taking away the space that these wound strings need to freely rotate. And in my experience, I've found that they do this so effectively that it's the tiniest amount of extra space that it gives you that helps to alleviate the amount of fret slap. So again, but when we come to trial it, we go through each note. Tiny bit of that end, and so what I do typically is, this is where it gets a little bit smoke and mirrors-y, but I've got a little bit of choky something at that end, call it slap. What I'm going to do is I'll use the tool, place it down, and when I say I'm going to focus, I'm going to just transfer my slight bit of downward pressure to this end section here, where that little bit of slap was showing itself, and I just apply a little bit more downward pressure. I hardly use the word force because it's very gentle, and then I'm going to move on from that, because I know that's as much as I can do for that area. But it's pretty good. It's pretty slap free. Now we recalibrate for the A track, and this one now looks like it's flattening out a bit on this side, so it feels, no, it's about right. It's flattened out a little bit since the high E side. So now we're going to do the A, and again, same technique. We're going to just place this on here. We're going to leave this as stiff and as keeping its own shape as possible, and we're just going to use repetition with as little downward force as necessary as possible, just so that it can do its job and, you know, impose its ideal curve onto the less than ideal fretboard with its hills and valleys. And you know, you could, to somebody watching this, they wouldn't think I'm doing anything else other than leveling frets. And if you can sense, what I'm really doing is I'm just thinking about it differently. I'm thinking about individual highs and lows. On the wound strings, I'm thinking impose the ideal curve. A little bit around about here. So again, I'm going to do the same thing. Notice when I do this repeat, sometimes I turn the bar around, just because and I'm going to focus on this area here, which means I'm going to, if any downward force, it's going to be on this spot here. And as so far I've continued, I'm doing a second pass now on this area, which seemed to me to have a little bit of slap still left in the string. I know it's a very low action, so I'm not going to expect too much from it. Technically my brain is telling me that Chris's chosen action is already a fraction too low, and it's going to require, you know, this careful leveling to get it to work. There you go. See that? Made it go away. And the final low E. So had it not gone away at that point, I would have been then thinking, are we pushing it too far with the action? Can we really get below a 1.5? Because this is about 1.2. You know, is it really the best thing? Well, I've had 1mm actions on various Les Paul SGs in the past, and the SG seems to do it. Seems to like that low action because of the way the neck seems to respond very flexibly to truss rod adjustments, and because it doesn't have a great chunk of it caught in a block of maple at the other end, or a block of mahogany, i.e. the body, it tends to, the whole neck tends to adjust in one smoother curve, which isn't a bad thing. So SGs tend to be very good for getting a very low action, last rate action out of it. So again, I'm just thinking, imperfect curve, let me impose this perfect curve onto there, repetition more than force, so that we get a nice ziz, slap free thing out of it. And we test the notes again. So still somewhere around about here. We are low, but let's keep trying it. So I'm going to concentrate on this middle section now, and the way I kind of feel about this is if it's not going to take care of it with this run, I might not want to go and push too hard, too much further. So kind of the experience is kicking in, saying I don't really want to, you know, trade out a lot more metal when I know that I've set a really challenging target action anyway. There's no point getting rid of all your fret metal just to prove you can have the lowest ever action on a Les Paul. So just up to there is still a bit. Well, let's take a look at the action here realistically. I mean, that we are at 1.2, if that, and that is, I'll do a tiny bit more focused on there, but I'm not going to do any more than that after that, because 1.2 is extremely low for any guitar really, anything but an SG in my experience. So I'm just focusing a little bit more downward pressure on this section that was giving me that little bit of slap, and that's my lot. Don't want to do any more. So I just know it from experience. You know, if you use this method a lot, you'll get to that point. Depends how you hit this, doesn't it? Now, of course, the factoring in on this is that there's barely any relief. Let's see if we can add a little bit of relief without changing the world too much. Because relief gives you a bit more space for the strings to move. Well, I think that's about as low as I'm going to go with the leveling. If it needs any more, I'm going to put on a tiny bit of height at that end. Okay, so there's my judgment call, and it's one I make all the time when doing this. Now, things I've got to do next is just tie, I want to glue down this little sticky up bit of veneer here so it doesn't get upset every time I put a nut in here, and we're going to tweak that. But anyway, that's this section finished, the film sections. So what I'm going to do is stop this section, and we'll be back for the setup. Guzzling drink. I've got about 2 litres of squash, and it's replacing all that liquid lost during the day. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take off the strings. They've done their time, they've done their hard work for us. Get rid of those, and then we'll recrown the frets, and then we'll get ready to polish out, sand and polish everything out. I'll probably have a close-up look at this point at the saddle. Actually, before I do anything else, let's have a look. Is it that bad? No, it's not that bad. It's so tiny. I wouldn't recommend moving it. It's already, I mean, it's minuscule, the amount. I think we'll just leave it where it is. It's not bad. You can get over obsessed with tiny details sometimes and create more work for yourself than is sensible. Come on. Right, this one's got... So Chris, you're going to have to promise me that you're never going to do this locking the strings off business. If you do that, I'm going to get spiked like I just did, and you're going to run a high risk of having a sharp thing poked into the headstock finish, and you just don't want that. So I'm going to have to go in there with a sharp thing to pull this apart, and it's just not good. In fact, I'm going to snip this bit because it's doing my head in. Yeah, so please don't put those little coils or those little loops of string, because they're just asking for trouble from anybody who isn't you, who has to come and do anything, and then you end up getting a piece of your metal stuck in my finger, which isn't fair. So, you promise now? Cool. Right. Okay, so I'm going to thank you, that's all very good. I'm going to take care of this little thing. I'll probably do that off camera in a minute. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to take off the things here, and I'm going to get me a piece of quick brush down to get dust off there. And now we're going to do a straightforward bit that we've done a million times before. We're going to recrown the frets. Now these have nibs on the end, but our fret crowning file will sort of ride over the top of those because they're sort of right on the ends. I haven't yet made a guitar from scratch with nibs on, and I kind of fancied doing it because it's the sort of fiddly thing I would enjoy, even though there are a lot of people, it drives them nuts that Gibson ever thought of doing that. And I sort of see why they did it. It protects the fingers from having to come into contact with any, sharp ends of the frets. I think it's not a bad idea. And it's not rocket science, it's just a matter of making sure the binding covers the end of the frets. In other words, the frets are cut short in flush with the fingerboard. Then you route the binding channel. Do you do it that way? Oh, I don't know, I can't remember. But anyway, it's not rocket science to do, and I kind of fancied it, but I haven't got round to it yet. I think secretly I like the idea of scraping the thing and leaving leaving the little nib on the end. So I'm just recrowning now to round off any flat spots on the fret from the leveling part of things. Now I think that the playing action is probably a fraction too low for the low strings on this guitar. I mean, there's a reason why I've picked 1.5 millimeters as my sort of basic target. It's because it's as low as you really want to go, in conjunction with a flat neck. If you go any lower, even if you could go any lower, the problem is the lower you go with your action, the more susceptible it is to variations in temperature and humidity and so on and so forth. So because the lower you go, the less clearance you've got. And if you've hardly got any clearance, but the weather changes, then before you know it, you've your neck may have flattened slightly, and the little bit of clearance that we had prior to that, because the neck had some curvature in it, is suddenly gone, and the customer gets the guitar and it suddenly starts buzzing where it didn't before, and it's not good for them, and it's not good for me in the long run. So one of the things I had to learn to do in the first years of doing Relove guitars was step back from pushing it, always pushing it to its absolute limit. You know, there's a part of me realised I was trying to show off what I could do, you know, but it just became, it risked being counterproductive in the end, and I just thought there's nothing gained for me or for my customer by doing that. And so the same applies here, is that, you know, I know for a fact that lower than 1.5 millimeters on the low E is just asking for fret slap. It's unnecessary. So I think we'll adjust that to the 1.5, which would be my target, and I think the high E should be pretty much about right. Okay, so we're almost done. Now once I've done this part of it, I'm going to do the polishing out, which requires masking the whole of the fretboard, and then sanding and polishing of the frets out through a sequence of papers which runs from 400 grit all the way through to 12,000. So it's a fair old something or other, gradient, no, that's not the word, continuum, no, anyway, it goes a good spectrum, a wide spectrum of paper grades of grit. So I'm just going to clean most of the black pen stuff off at this stage, and the dust off the board, so that I can get a good grip with my masking tape. And I'll do the masking tape and the fret sanding and polishing off camera, because it's a chance for me to charge batteries and recover a little bit from all my ebook video performances, all that stuff to camera, you know, it's like when you're a TV anchor man or something, tiring. And also I want to glue down this thing off camera as well, so I don't want in a rush. Yeah, so I'll do that. Now I'll sand it all out, and then I'll come back when we're ready to put the strings on, and we'll be close to the completion at that point. Okay, so bit of recharge time. See you in a bit. All right, we're polished out, and we're time to get some new strings on, ladies and gents and other peoples. Let's just zoom you in. Now I'm going to zoom you in to this end of things, because I want you, Chris, to do your strings this way from now onwards. I know it's presumptuous and insulting of me, but your techs in the future will love you. So, just a thought. I'm going to put all these through. You won't see it looking at the wrong end, but I'm putting all these through the stop bar for a minute. And I've raised the, by the way, I've raised the bridge a tiny fraction, which I may have to reduce again, but you don't really, you do it blind a little bit. So anyway, so I'm going to hook up all the strings at the stop bar end, but with the adjustable nut, this isn't glued in because I had such a bad experience with glue this time. So it's not glued in because it's perfectly tight fitting, and I just want to leave it there. So the thing about the adjustable nut is that the top section can always come out, so you just need to be aware of that and catch it if it does. And when you're taking off the strings, to change them, then you should make it reversal of putting them on. So the thing to keep in mind is when you've got your strings lined up in the stop bar to put them on, you want start with the G and the D to go in first to basically hold the hold the nut down. So I'm going to start with the G, put it through and get it in the slot, get it in its own slot, make sure it's all the way through. And I've got myself the electronic screwdriver thing to make sure it works. I can do it quicker. There we are. Okay, so thing to do is pull back 1 fret's worth, hold it down, do it up, and as it comes around, make sure the loose one goes under the held one to begin with, and as it comes around a second time, yank it up, keep the held one under tension, which is always quite fun to do when the stop bar is moving around, and then just keep this going underneath the loose one until it settles down, and that's your lot. That's all you need on there, and that will now hold the adjustable nut in place. Now I'm going to just do is the D now, and that's the 2 middle ones locking the thing in place. Okay, so same thing all the way through, come up to the end, grab hold on the first fret, pull back 1 fret's worth, and start winding. Keep it tense, hold the loose, the held end over the loose one first time, and as the loose one comes round, pull it up and push the held one under for the second time round. And that's a kind of locking, self-locking device there. And then we go with the A and the low E and so on. Now once we've done this, we have to do the other important thing, and highly recommend that you do this consciously, and that will be to stretch out any slack in the strings. It has to be done deliberately. It won't just come out of its own accord over time. A lot of people think it will, but it just doesn't. So it'll hold a load of slack in there for as long as it takes to slowly let it out and upset your playing. So to avoid that, you want to take the time to do it deliberately, consciously, and it can take 15 minutes or more to get it out, and the idea is you just do it until the string won't detune any further, and when you've got there, keep stretching it until it won't detune any further. Whoops. And when you get there, then you know it's going to be pretty stable. And these two things, the nut and the stretching out of the slack, are 100% of the culprits in keeping your guitar in tune, or the things that keep your guitar staying in tune when you play. People think it's the tuners. It isn't. They don't have anything to do with it at all. They just make it smoother to get into tune or not, but they won't hold the guitar in tune. If your nut is not Tusq, or it's the wrong, you know, the slots are cut wrong, your guitar will continue going out of tune even if you've got £1,000 tuners on there. Similarly, if you've taken care of the nut but you haven't done the stretch or the slack in the strings, your guitar will continue going out of tune for a long time. And if your nut is wrong, it doesn't matter how much you stretch the strings out, it'll still go out of tune all the time, because a sticking nut can put it out of tune forever. It's that bad. Right, so there are all our strings on. We're going to now cut them short. This one I have to bring back round, slack off for a minute, and then tighten it back up. So no tying knots in it, please. It doesn't achieve anything, and it just hurts people like me. Makes us cry. Right, now I'm going to sort of, first of all, let's zoom out. First of all, we know that we've got the nut half of the tuning stability equation sorted out, because we've got a Tusq nut which gives us Tusq, what's the word, that word, lubricated material. That's this thing. It's trying to sit in there, but it's not completely flat, but it's as near as, now it is. And both sides. Yeah, so we've got the Tusq material, which gives us the best chance of keeping it in tune, and we've got the adjustability so that the frets are now, the slots leave the strings at the correct first fret, or we can set the correct first fret action, which gives us, cuts out any tuning and intonation problems down at that end, which is great. So we have the nut part all taken care of, and then the next part is the stretching. So we'll tune up first. Ah, that's not sitting on the saddle. That's why it sounds like a sitar. Okay, so there's our tuning. One thing I just want to check is the playing action at this end now. So we make sure. Right, now that's gone a fraction too high. So I'm going to have to undo this very slightly, which is a pretty silly device. Well, I get it. Locking is good. And that's gone click. Let's jump down fractionally over. So let's take this down a tiny bit. Now it's good. We'll get that to the right height. And we have 1.5. That's good. Right. Before it goes anywhere else, I'm just going to tighten this little locking grub screw up to do what it's supposed to do, which is hold the bridge in place. Ah, lovely. Right. So now we're out of tune again because we moved the bridge. So let's just get it into tune. Now, listen to this. You're not hearing any pings from the strings. There's no constriction in the nut at all. The tuning is precise and smooth. The strings are going through the nut perfectly. Now, here's the fun. Grab hold of the strings between thumb and forefinger, and we're going to push between thumb and forefinger to stretch them. And this is going to put it way out of tune, and we want to keep doing this until it stops going out of tune, at which point we will be as stretched out as we can be and ready to go and play. And what I hope you'll see, Chris, is that even without the String Butler, this thing, you'll pick it off the wall. If you even have to tune it, it'll drop into tune almost instantly without any fight, and then it will stay in tune for the whole session. And that's really, I mean, it's a totally different beast when that happens. So plenty of detuning. Nice. Okay, so very often you'll find there's more slack in the wound strings, of course. Seems to be always the way. So we expect those to go out of tune most, but we just keep doing them until it stops going out of tune, and then we'll be good to go. We'll double check the intonation, which I think should be alright, and my supposition, if you remember from the beginning, was that I bet you it'll go into intonation on those last two strings much easier now we've got new strings on there. That's my theory. Close. A few more pulls and we're gonna be good. Close. I think we're pretty much there. Very, very slight. Happy as a sand boy. Bag, sandbag, sand boy, whatever. Righty ho, on go the little doofers. These things. That slight delamination there, which I suspect is from the repair kind of days. I don't really think there's any more I can do with it. I don't know whether it's even worth trying to glue, maybe put the glue in. Didn't seem to like that bit of super glue. Didn't seem to do much, but maybe put some stickier glue in there and just put a small clamp on it to keep it down. But it's a little bit difficult to do. You have to somehow clamp either side. But yeah, well, I'll have a look afterwards. Right, so everything, the main stuff all done and lovely. Let us just plug in and check the intonation one more time. Okay, so intonation check. You can definitely hear those bridge components rattling still. On target. Yes. Perfect, as predicted. There you go. Trust the pattern. Do you remember? The pattern is always right. Okay, I'm not going to be playing it out loud. I know you all love to hear Gibsons, but it's late on a Sunday evening and I'm tired and going home. Yeah, all good. Phew. Thank you for watching. Chris, I hope you enjoyed that. And yeah, sorry about all the little stops and starts with my clapper boards and stuff, but that's really helped me to put together the content I need for my ebook. It's a pain to have to do it, but well, it's not actually. I enjoy getting the materials, but it's yeah, it's got to be a bit sort of careful planning-ish. So there we have it. Gibson ES 335, adjustable Tusq nut fitted, perfect first fret action set. Way to go. Oh, and no more Mr. Butler. See you soon.